I'm going to kick off with why I read. And my answer really is I'm something of an insomniac at the moment. So for the past 2 years, it's what I do in the middle of the night. But the other thing to add is, for me, I don't know about you, and it's been said a bit by other speakers here today, it's something, reading fiction is something of a guilty pleasure for me. Because I did a PhD that took 3.5 years, and all that time I was reading academic books and journals, and so I didn't dare give myself permission to read anything beyond that for pleasure. So as soon as I finished, since I completed, I've only read fiction. So that's kind of why I read. But how about you?
Okay, I'm Lynn Anderson. I'm from Scotland. Why do I read? Well, the answer is I can't think why I wouldn't read. If I cast my mind back, I learned to read very early. I was reading before I went to school. It was my other world. Initially, I was quite a distance from a public library. And back in those days, where I lived in Scotland, there was not a lot of books in the house. My next door neighbour, I had a friend next door, and they came from a family of one child. So they had more books than us, but they were very, very generous in letting me go and read all her books as well. And then after that, I had to go to the library. Now, the library was quite a walk away, probably 2 miles. And those days, public libraries only allowed you out 2 books at a time. So they had to be carefully chosen and walked home with. And if you read voraciously, you finish those 2 books easily in 2 days. So then you've got to go back for the next 2. Luckily now, public libraries in Scotland will let you have numerous amounts of books. So books, for me, have always been a huge part of my life. When I went to university, I could choose to either do English or mathematics, and I decided to do mathematics. I love maths too, so the reading was not part of my degree, apart from differential calculus and stuff like that. I went on to do a degree in computing science, and I taught computing science for the last 20 years of my teaching career. There was a lot of reading to do in that, but as, like Nicola here, it was very, very concerned with the subject itself. And then I did a master's degree in education, and like Nicola, all my reading became academic. I found that really, it was both interesting but also quite traumatic, because what you really couldn't do with that type of reading was to escape into other people's lives and other people's worlds and other people's countries. You were very much anchored in the literature that was associated with both teaching and understanding. So once I emerged out of that, I eventually got to the stage to do something that I really wanted to do for a long, long time, and that was to become a writer. I notice quite a lot of women that I speak to often don't become writers till later in their life. And I mean, I had 3 children. I basically waited till they were at the stage that I could actually have some privacy to write. The reading aspect of it, don't know about Nicola, but if I'm in the middle of a book and I write crime fiction, I have a long-running series, A Forensic Scientist, a woman, I find myself unable to read any other books like that. For 2 reasons. One, you don't want to steal their plot. And the second one is, if it's really, really good, all you can think about is how rubbish your book is. You're in the middle of writing, so that's not a good move. But what you can do is to escape out of this world that's going on in your head, these people that are marching around your head, and just walk into another world. So I normally have at least half a dozen books by my bed, and it's about mood. I choose the book that fits my mood at that time. So I'm in the middle of them all.
So to respond, I also, so I'm a slightly different type of writer. I'm a graphic novelist, which means I'm a comics writer or maker. So the book I did is drawn as well as written, and like you, if I'm working on something, I don't really read graphic novels for pleasure always, but I do read to get ideas of how to draw and inspirations. But actually, what I did, I was here at the festival as a visitor last year, and the reason was I'd finished my academic reading and I wanted to go on a trip to India because I wanted to travel from Delhi down to Trivandrum, which is a journey on the train I'd done in my 20s. And I think it was said this morning, it's a 3-day train journey and it's a perfect opportunity to read. And a friend, I feel I came very late to Arundhati Roy, but The God of Small Things. But a friend of mine recommended I take that. And of course, the beauty of it is the Kindle on the phone. So I read that while I was on the train, and it was, again, the thing about reading is the sense of place. So when you visit a country or a city, it can evoke a lot more. But what I'd also brought with me as a physical object, 'cause I hadn't had time to read it before, is a graphic novel or an anthology of comics artists called This Side, That Side. And it's a restoring partition, an anthology of 30 graphic narratives. And this was good because it was reading my form, the graphic novel, but it was by a collection of, or a collaborative exercise between artists and writers from Pakistan and India working collaboratively on these stories. And it was curated by Vishwajyoti Ghosh, and it was a lot of people involved in this project, but it was a restorying by a younger generation. So then they themselves were the children of parents who'd experienced partition firsthand. And it was really great. And this sounds a bit weird, but I was in one of those carriages on the trains with 4 bunks. And there was a Russian tourist, myself from the UK, a French-Italian tourist with a broken leg, and a German tourist with a dog. And you can book, I booked the carriage, but you can't book whether you're up or down. And it felt a little bit, I was reading about partition, I was thinking, well, it's just all rather random. And I was trapped in the top thinking, I want to be down there. So it was a little bit, I was thinking of, it taught me a lot about the history of India. And as you travel through the countryside, it's an experience of a land. And then when I got to Trivandrum, and I met Sunita Balakrishna, who's here as a speaker at the festival, and she gave me a book by Anis Salim, who's again a locally a Kerala author, called Small Town Sea. So again, I was given this physical book, and I took the journey beyond by immersed in Kerala and reading about Kerala. And in Kochi, I met with some comics artists from India again, who then also on my Kindle, another, Umi Sinha, who's also a speaker here, the same publisher as me, had been speaking about her book Belonging, again about her family connections with India. One of her parents is Indian, she's based in the UK. So again, I was thinking all the time about this, why myself as a tourist am visiting India. So it was a really, and again, when I met the comics artists, I was introduced to further comics works by Indian women artists. So that's a... What? I had another question for you, Lynn, is that if you say, I was wondering about your research and the process of your own writing and what you get inspiration from if you're not reading other crime.
Okay. Well, one thing I wanted to say just before I talk about the research, I think if you're going to be a writer, and I believe a reader as well, the most important thing are people, because any book is about character. And people often accuse, they talk about crime writing as if it's about the crime. It's never about the crime. It's always about the character. And that's why you can't sustain a series of novels over 13, 14, 15 books unless people are captivated by the characters that walk through the book. Now, I would add into that, it's not just the character, the people character, it's the character of the place. And the books that I write set in Scotland don't all happen in one location. I've lived all over Scotland, so there are books set on the islands, there are books set in the Highlands, there are books set in the cities, and in each of them, one of the major characters is always, well, I should say it's also the weather, because Scotland has very changeable weather, which affects everything. It affects people's feelings. A lot of words in Scots reflect how the person feels about the thing. So, for instance, we've got a word in Scots to describe a day that I'm sure weather you will never have here. It's a day where it's very grey and it rains and it's a bit miserable. Okay, the word in Scots is the word dreich, spelled D-R-E-I-C-H, and it doesn't just describe the weather, the person, and the weather. It describes the feeling that the weather has on someone. So it's very demonstrative type of word. The other thing I just wanted to say was, as a teacher, I lived in a very remote part of northern Nigeria for 5 years, where my husband was an irrigation engineer, and I taught in the local school, even though I hadn't taught that age group before. But what struck me during those 5 years was how absolutely essential it is for children to learn to read. It changes their lives. And I also, at home in Scotland, I visit quite a few of the prisons. And I go in and I do workshops and I do readings with the prisoners. And what shows you how important reading is a lot of the young men I've dealt with had very poor reading skills. So the worlds they were missing were because they couldn't read. And once they got those skills, they then found they could write as well. They could write their story, but the magical thing now was they could change the ending of the story. They could make the story different. And that's why reading is, I think it's imperative to life to read.
Yeah. I was going to pick up on the weather thing. Because I'm actually here also because with the comics artists from Kerala who I met, we're working on a collaborative exchange project, and we'll be on a panel tomorrow. They're coming tomorrow to speak on a panel. And it's called Expectations, and it's about the expectations you have about a country you've never visited and what the reality is of visiting a country. So in the summer last year, the Tina and Pratik, who will be here tomorrow, came with an illustrator who they work with, Priya Kurian, and they visited us in England. And it is a stereotype, but they just straight away picked up how myself and my husband discuss the weather every single day. And so that became part of, really, it's really like that. The British talk about the weather all the time. So now I'm here, and again, it's again reading works by Kerala artists in the heat gives a slightly different interpretation of a story, and it feels really nice, actually.
Yeah, I think that's completely true, because I started writing when I was living in northern Nigeria, which was really we weren't that far from the camel market, where people moved from that up through the Sahara Desert. So it was very dry. And the place I lived was, it was an irrigation camp. They were planting sugarcane and putting in canals. And it was quite a racial camp, there were people from many places, including India, involved in this work. Sri Lanka, Russia, Yugoslavia, and the various people from Nigeria, the Igbo and the Hausa and the Yoruba, and we were all in there together. I'd never been in a more sort of mixed society as I was when we worked there, which was a wonderful inspiration for writing. So in fact, when I started out, I wrote short stories, literally short stories that were published or on the BBC, but I wrote them not from the British perspective or the Scots, the one family there that was from Scotland. I wrote the story from the different perspectives. So I wrote from Mr. Ugwu, who was an Igbo man that was loosely modelled on someone I knew out there. And it was a fascinating experience to see all these cultures existing in this one place just south of the Sahara Desert. And one other thing to say there, Ian Rankin, who's a very famous Scottish crime writer, says, if you're going to visit a country and you've never been before, I would advise you to go and find who the contemporary crime writer is of that country. And the reason is that a crime novel takes you into all stratas of society. No strata is left unmarked, and therefore you get a very strong sense of how society is functioning in that particular country. I haven't found any crimes here at all. It seems awfully well behaved. So I don't think I can write a book here.
I was also going to add about your reference to learning to read as a child, because like you, my mother taught me very young to read. In fact, she bribed me. So every time I finished, she gave me money, but it worked. So, but as a result, like you, and the libraries, when I was growing up in England, the libraries were very part of our weekly ritual of going to take books for free, and that was important. But again, because I think if you learn early and naturally to read, it does become a real pleasure, and still is for me. And it's something that if you then have children, because it's a pleasure for yourself, you push it, or not push it, but you really introduce it at a young age. Yeah, and it's and I don't know about you, but what's nice about our daughter now is at an age where she's quite a critical reader, but she will recommend stories, and that's what I really enjoy. That she and discussing work. So I wonder if
yes, I agree. One thing I would say, though, it's much better nowadays when children who turn out to have dyslexia are actually identified as such. And the study of that and the way to deal with it has, because a lot of people were left behind. People accused them of being stupid when it was nothing to do with them being stupid at all. But I say my greatest pleasure at the moment, I have a granddaughter of 10, and she has dyslexia, but she is a really avid reader. And it hasn't been easy to get to that stage for her, but she's been very determined. And the variety of books now for children is just astonishing. And they're great fun for adults too, I have to say. I very much enjoy. And I think we have a lot to thank J.K. Rowling for, because when she wrote Harry Potter, the explosion, whether you like Harry Potter or not, the fact was the number of children that got into that world and became avid readers because of it. It's astonishing, the difference that and I think that has been the prelude to what I see with my granddaughter and her friends, with the books, the availability of books. And they're not formalized the way they were when I read them. You've got this wonderful change in font size. You're allowed to make lots of noises. Children are allowed to be cheeky and naughty in these books, as well as having adventures. Yeah.
And one of the things to add to that is the pictures. And I, again, as a comics artist, I champion the visual. I always think it's a shame when in Britain, as children, you're encouraged to read children's books, which are heavily illustrated, and then suddenly at 10 or around that age, it's young fiction comes completely text only. And it's such a shame because life is so visual and the stories are so visual. And also, although in the comics community in Britain, we resist a little the idea that comic books or comics are for children, because books like my own are very adult subject matter about bereavement and often about trauma or illness. But nevertheless, it's certainly reading a book with picture, a comic book in an hour, a graphic novel, makes it a lot more accessible. Mm-hmm. So if you're not comfortable with reading text, or if it's in English, if your English reading of English language isn't so strong, then the pictures can help the meaning. So it's the best language.
I agree. And you get a lot of books now that are, that age group of 7, 8 to 11. And that's when they start going into chapters. But you get little drawings. And I'll tell you, I've got really, really excited about this because I've been writing a children's book. This is my first children's book. It features a dog, Blaze dog detective. So the dog is watching you. But the wonderful thing about it is the dog it's about is alive and well and lives on the island of Skye. But I've got lots of photographs of him. So what will happen is the graphic artist, I'll put in a little photograph in the text, but then it will be changed to a sketch. And you can have such fun with that because there's a map of the island, so people don't know, if they don't know the island, they can plot where they're going in the island. And I think it's that business of moving between an image and text that reinforces the text. It reinforces the words for you. And I think that's really important.
Well, I would respond that is illustration, and that's the beauty of illustration, is reinforcing. But what the comics form does is
the story.
It tells two stories. So the text actually can tell a completely different message than the image in a very succinct, compact way. So that's...
I'll maybe add a little bit before we start questions, because Nicola asked me a question earlier and I forgot to answer it. I was so busy talking about other things. The business of writing a book, particularly if you work in the area I work, there's a lot of research. But what's fascinating about it is when you approach people, they're very free to give their expertise. So, for instance, the book I'll probably read from when I I can't remember, it's tomorrow or the next day, is the opposite of here. It's set up on top of Cairngorm Mountain in Scotland, which is very, very deep in snow, and it's in the middle of a blizzard. And there's a bad thing happens up there. But in order to write anything like that, you then have to find the person that really knows about that. So what you do, you go and get the Cairngorm Mountain Rescue, who go out and rescue people from the top of the Cairngorms. And as you ask them a question, you suddenly get all these wondrous ideas about what you might do, because they tell you the truth of what happens up there. And to just illustrate that briefly before we stop, I found out that when a death happens up in the mountains of Scotland, it's automatically a crime scene. Didn't used to be. So if you wanted to get rid of your spouse, you could take them up Cairngorm and sort of push them off. But now everything is a crime scene. But the first people on the scene are not police. They are the Cairngorm Mountain Rescue, because they're the only people that can get to some of these locations. The police cannot. And the second thing I found out, which changed the whole story, was in the past we used to have the RAF would come in with their helicopters and they lifted injured people off the hill and dead bodies off the hill. And then the current government stopped that and they put it out to a private company called Bristow's. Now wait till you hear the difference between the RAF and Bristow's. Bristow's will lift you off the hill if you're injured, but they will not lift off bodies that are dead. Okay, if you're going to make a laugh about that, what they did was they now phone in the Cairngorm Mountain Rescue and they're asked, are there any signs of life? And Willie says yes, even though the man's long dead. Now, you see, once you talk to the real people, the story develops. And that's why I come back round again to the idea that all writing is it's all character driven. And what your children learn from books, and what we all learn from books, is what it's like to be somebody other than you.
Yes, and also what it's like to be in a certain situation. So I think that's particularly with crime or psychological thrillers, that what's it like if you murder someone and try and cover it up, for example. Which I think that's the beauty of reading and actually other forms, is that it's making you reflect on what would I do if I was in this position. So you're learning about being a human and expanding your own experience through other people's experiences. I was just going to add, in the research process, because I'm working with the visual, it's like you saying you don't read other crime fiction. Rather than the graphic novel, I find I get inspiration from other art forms. So I'm more likely to look at art in a gallery and art, often conceptual art is how they address a subject matter or an idea, and film too, rather than the form itself. And then you apply that or take elements back. Do you find that you look to other forms?
Yeah, well, actually I do. I write for film as well. So, which the big difference, of course, writing for film and writing for books is everything in film must be visual. You don't have that wonderful luxury in a book of jumping into somebody's head and telling your reader what they're thinking about. In fact, once when I've been working in a film and I go back to a book, it's so nice to be able to go back into somebody's head without trying to find a way where you, the watcher, will know what's in their head by some visual image or by their expression or the way that they move or act. And most people don't, I can't speak for Bollywood films, but apart from the fact I watched a couple on the plane coming over here, but the way it works really, where I'm working from, the actual dialogue comes in at the end. It only comes in when you can't put the story over visually. And films that don't have a lot of dialogue travel further. More people in more countries watch them because they don't need to rely a simple translation of the dialogue. They can get most of the story from the imagery. So it's a totally different form.
Find it an easy switch?
Well, I would never switch in the middle of a project because I wouldn't find that easy at all. No, because, I would find myself writing scenes in the book that, although I would say that, the way I write the books are very visual because that's how they begin. It's an image of a scene and I have no idea what's going to happen next. So it does operate in my head like a scene, yeah.
Lynn Anderson, you mentioned that Harry Potter brought back physical book reading to children. My question is, are you scared of algorithms replacing others? Just like I recently read that a Agatha Christie algorithm mimics Agatha Christie writing, a software. Are you scared of that?
Right, okay, I'm not quite sure. Correct me if I've got you wrong. Are we comparing stories appearing in actual books, physical books, with other ways, perhaps through the internet or, yeah.
My question is regarding a artificial intelligence algorithm mimics a fiction writer's creativity and writes a novel.
Yeah.
I recently read Agatha Christie's crime fiction mimicked by a software.
Right, yeah, I understand better now. We have this thing, you know, Scottish crime fiction. Agatha Christie, I was a big fan of. It's very much English classic crime fiction, which I adored. Scottish crime fiction comes from a completely different place. It didn't really show its face in a big way until a very famous Scottish writer called Willie McIlvanney. And it's he wrote more about, he had a character called Laydeez set in Glasgow who was a detective and also a philosopher. And Scottish crime fiction is sort of reflects the darkness and the light in us all, and it's very much about, it's told in our own language, in our own sense of place, and it's not cozy. So Agatha Christie killed lots of people, but there was never much blood. But maybe that's why we call our crime festival Bloody Scotland. It is a different type of crime fiction, and I don't know if I've answered your question correctly.
My question is, are you scared of?
Am I scared of?
Scared of, because fiction writers are belongs to a vanishing species. Because algorithms or softwares take over creative writing.
Okay.
Are you scared of it?
Am I? Well, what I would say is, my friend asked me recently, how did I write what I write? Does it not scare me? Now, the thing is, if you're the writer, you are in total control of what you do. When you read someone else's writing, it can be very scary what they deal with. But I think if I come back to what I mentioned about the prisoners, and once they write, they change the story of their life. They're trying to control it. So as a writer, you write the last page. You know, you write the ending. You decide what justice is being served here. So I don't find that scary, although occasionally it's a bit harrowing because I put my main character through, you know, a lot of darkness before we reach the light. But I find other people's books scarier to read.
So in your writing, you're more focusing on the person's psychological development as much as the crime itself. Is that what you're saying?
That's a big thing in the books I write.
And that's why it's interesting to us, the readers, because so it's not just this format. A writer can push beyond a format of this is the, you know,
and the truth is that there was a lady came to the school I was at who was head of a university, and she said to the girls in the audience, a woman is like a tea bag. You don't know her strength till you put her in hot water. So the whole point of taking a character on a journey, and you're testing them, and you as a writer don't actually know how they'll react. And on many occasions it's really surprising how they deal with a situation. It's a bit like yourself. You probably thought you knew yourself when you were 18, because basically you knew everything when you were 18. And then you got to 28 and you decided maybe you didn't know everything. And then when you get to my age, you realize the only thing you know is that you don't know.
The only thing you know is eventually we'll die.
Oh, no.
Dark.
Sorry, would anyone else like a question? Oh, we've got a few. We'll get this gentleman next at the back. Right.
Oh, I saw the film The Writer. The Wife.
Oh,
Sorry, The Wife.
The Wife.
The Wife. Did you see it? Anyway, it's about a woman who wants to be a writer, but in the end, she uses her husband's name.
Oh, no.
And he writes her novels, really, and it's about this kind of complicated relationship they have. But my question was there ever a point in your either of your working lives where you started to question, could I, as a woman writer, write this? Or, you know, kind of found you kind of came to a kind of, like a written
it's
glass
a very
ceiling?
good question because it gets talked about all the time in crime fiction about who is the victim. And what you do also find when you look back at Agatha Christie was unusual in that we knew her full name. But many of the female crime writers didn't give their full name. They gave an initial and the name. Because I still get tales from some libraries where they say when they can recommend books to women by men and written by men and women, but men will say, oh, don't give me a book by a woman. I don't want to read it. So then you get quite a lot of crime writers giving a name which could be either or, you know, and that's how they get round that sort of sense. I think it's changing because certainly some of the biggest name in crime fiction in both Scotland and the UK and America are female, yeah. But there is still an issue because what they'll say is they don't mind a man writing a scene which is a bad, in their eyes, a difficult scene. Why would a woman write that scene? But you have to remember in writing, as a writer, you don't give all the details of the scene. What you do is you just suggest what's happening. And people put in their thoughts. And on one occasion at our festival, Bloody Scotland, someone from the audience accused Ian Rankin in a particular book of writing a very bloody scene. And he looked really puzzled and he said, no, I didn't. Oh, yes, you did. It was a horrible scene. So we got the book and we went to the scene and he was right because she had put her imagination into the scene. It's like that bit when you've got a door and you, the audience, are saying, don't open that door. You know there's something behind that door. And you're experiencing the feeling of going and being terrified about the thought of someone going through the door. So,
my question is to Nicola. So you have written your memoir in the graphic form. So I don't know any major writer who has written her memoir in the graphic form. How challenging is it to write a memoir in the graphic form?
Well, you must come and read it, buy it from me. Because it was an experience, so the book is about the experience of bereavement following the death of my child, and I came to do this book in comics form 13 years after the experience. But the story was there, so in a sense, it unfolded. And also I think if you're writing about something emotional that you've experienced, I don't know, maybe in writing as well, it comes through your body onto the page, because I've done work since and I don't have that feeling of a kind of rush of it. I know exactly where I'm going. So for me, it was comfortable, but also I was at a big distance from the experience itself. I think it would have been a different work if I'd done it at the time. I did it in a reflective way, so I was thinking also about the taboos in the West around death, and the taboos particularly about a woman who has a child and then doesn't have a child, and the different status that you have, the change of status. So, thank you.
I just Googled you and I realized you had done your PhD in feminist cartoons and comics of the 70s. Could you please enlighten us? Because when I read that, I really couldn't figure out what it was all about.
Yes. When I started, I was an illustrator, and then I came to comics, the longer form, after 10 years of working as an illustrator. So I had the drawing skills, and then I realized I could work on this story slowly. But at the time in Britain, I realized I was entering a new community of comics artists. And when I said comics, people thought superhero or comics for children. and that's a very masculine endeavour in the West. So the history of comics in Britain and the USA and most of Europe is male, the men we think of. So because I'm a woman, I was thinking to position myself as a woman. So I was looking around for this and realizing there was this gap. And at the same time, I was studying postgraduate. And then I realized there's been no history written about women cartoonists and comics in Britain. And it does exist, but it didn't exist in the comics section of the library, of the archives. It existed within feminist literature. So in Britain, all feminist literature, including suffragette literature, but also from the 70s onwards, was heavily illustrated by humorous cartoons. So there are lots of magazines that came out of the 70s feminist movement, and then publishing companies set up that were run by women, feminist publishing companies, and they began publishing cartoon books by women. So by cartoon, I mean one panel. And I was interested in this story that had happened that's not celebrated or much written about in Britain about feminism. That firstly, the humour of feminism, of British feminism, and the visual in cartoon form. So that's tomorrow I'll bring you my book to show you. Come to our panel tomorrow, because it's, and then of course, as with all things, you know, it probably as a crime writer, once you start thinking, oh, am I the only woman who, and then you suddenly find there's loads of women making art, of which Sarah Lightman is here as my good friend, and we together have researched and discovered many women around the world making comics, and often about women's experience, our own personal experience, of which Sarah's book is coming out too, and she'll be speaking about it. So it's that idea of, again, this the female experience in autobiographical form is a big part of feminism in the West as well, about sharing experiences and making them public, then brings other women to come forward. And of course, you know, then we think of Me Too. And even, you know, both Sarah and myself have contributed in comics form to an anthology of Me Too comics just this year for publication in America. So I hope that begins up. But please, I'd love to show you. I then, with Myriad, I co-edited a book of the cartoons and comics of 250 years of women's cartoons and comics in Britain for a public reader, for a general reader. So I have copies tomorrow. So thank you.